Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. We're coming to you during this pandemic time, for those of you that are watching this program sometime in the future. And as I've said on some of my more recent programs, that during this time, of course, we aren't getting live guests to join me on the program, not because I don't have a long list of potential guests, but we're not doing much traveling anymore. So we've used a variety of programs during this last couple of weeks. But then, today I was sitting in my office and I had a guest in my office who was happening to visit his mother and me on the farm. And we were talking and we thought, wow, what a great opportunity. He's never been a guest on The Journey Home, but then he has. So my guest tonight is my middle son, Peter. Welcome to The Journey Home, Peter.
Thank you, Dad. I appreciate it. Good to be here.
It's great. I'm just amazed that we've never done this with all the years, but it's just been where you've been and where we've been.
I say, this is the first time I've been at home for an extended period of time in, 6 years, 7 years maybe.
Right,
yeah.
right.
So,
and those of you that are seeing Peter and seeing him sit there with his collar on, that's a part of the reason he's home, and part of the reason I wanted to have him on the program tonight, because he's right at the cusp of something that we prayed about for a real long time. What is that, Peter?
Come June 27th, I'll be ordained a priest at the Catholic Church. So very excited for that. It's been a long journey, of course, 4 years of college, 6 years of seminary, and a lot of prayer and discernment and wrestling with God and with myself. So it's pretty exciting for it to happen. Obviously, some strange circumstances under which it is going to happen, but any port in a storm, as they say. So.
Well, I did mention a moment ago that this was kind of his first time on the program. Actually, Peter did appear on the program once before. For those of you that have long-term viewers of the program may remember this, but he appeared a long time ago. And before we move on to your story, Peter, we're going to take just a glimpse to see Peter's first appearance on The Journey Home.
First of all, thank you for joining me on The Journey Home. It's always a pleasure. And I asked another person to join us on the set. My middle son, Peter, came with me on this trip. A couple years ago, I had my youngest, Richard, and the last time my older son was with me, we didn't get him on the set. But I wanted Peter to come up. You want to say hello to anybody at home?
Hello.
There's nobody out there. It's just a camera, Peter. Say hello to your mother and maybe our farm animals and the brothers. Good to have him with us. Peter's been with me all weekend. We were speaking at a conference in Houston, and he ran the book table, and he was a great little salesman. Wouldn't let me get close. He wanted to be the manager. So.
Collected more than $1,000.
Whoa, did a good job.
You remember that time?
I do, yeah. Yeah, obviously not much has changed, since then, but a little bit of hair relocation, but other than that, yeah.
That's right. My hair isn't quite as poofy as it was on that particular episode, but
must have helping a cow give birth or something before that. Yeah.
Could have been,
It was back in those days. Yeah.
Peter, it's just wonderful to have you here, and I don't know. I'd love to have your mother here talking about
Sure.
how long we've prayed for your vocation, and it wasn't that we were praying we want him to be a priest. We want always prayers. We want you to discern what God's calling you to do, and I know that's been your prayer. But we're going to talk about that later in the program, about vocation and all that. Maybe talk a bit about your experience at St. Meinrad, and also as you look forward to that. But as we normally do in The Journey Home, I want you to tell me about your journey of faith.
Sure. Well,
let the folk hear about your own journey of faith.
Well, as you mentioned right before the show, I was born into a not quite yet Catholic family, but getting there. As you mentioned, I didn't quite realize the exact timing of it, but you had resigned your pastorate a month or two before I was born.
Yeah.
In '91. So I was born in May '91. And not too long after that, I think it was a few months, I was baptized a Catholic, even though the rest of the family had not been brought into the faith yet, which I believe was the next Easter, right? It was the next Easter.
When we
Or was
came
it-
in, we
yeah.
came in actually
Or was it 2
the next December of 92.
Oh, I
So,
see. Okay,
yeah,
so it was a little while. So anyway, it is funny for me to think about sometimes, because as I was growing up, I didn't think about the fact that our family hadn't always been Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we would sit around in the living room and we would pray our rosary, and it didn't occur to me till a long time later in life that you guys, Mom and Dad, and in some ways my older brother John Mark, were trying to get used to the rosary just as much as, as kids. They were just, getting used to everything, getting used to being alive at that point. And so that was interesting, because I can think of ways that it affected how I grew up. I think one of the ways that I look back and I reflect on, and I'm thankful for, is that I grew up with a love for Scripture already. I remember distinctly this book. Now it was like a cartoon book, so I don't give all the credit to like I was this scholar or something. But there's this great cartoon book that you had, and they had these panels and these little captions, and it explained all the scriptures as kind of as a story. And I think I had gone through that whole thing like 3 times by the time probably by the time I received First Communion. But and it's one of those things where at the time I never thought that was strange. But now looking back, I realize your love for Scripture obviously had somehow found its way to us.
Well, you had always been, of course, both you and John Mark particularly, were readers early, and we're very self-disciplined in that. We eventually homeschooled you, as well as John Mark and Richard, partially because of when we were living at different places, because of what was available to us, especially when we moved to the farm. There we were. But one of the reasons we knew that you would do well with the homeschooling was because basically you said, all right, what do you want me to study? This. Good. You go to your room, that's what you do. But you had read the Bible through, like you said, at least 3 times.
At least 3 times.
Somewhere around the house is that old Bible, and it's just ripped to shreds.
I found it, yeah. I found it the other day, and I wanted to find it because I wanted to know the name of it so that I could recommend it to a few parents I knew. But now it was funny because when we were getting ready for First Communion, I remember Mom was helping teach one of the religious ed classes. And she was helping teach the one that I was in, because that was kind of a way to, that was a way for her to be in my teaching alongside helping other kids learn. Well, about halfway through the season, she kicked me out of her class. I always say kicked me out, it's a little harsh, but she kicked me out of her class because I wouldn't stop answering questions. And like she'd ask stuff about the Bible, and I'd be like, oh, I know this one, And so she moved me off to a different class. But so it was a bit of a different upbringing compared to probably a lot of Catholics. And as you mentioned, like it was kind of the Catholic version of being a pastor's kid. Because you were traveling around, you were giving talks, you were doing the journey home, and so there was a certain sense of, oh, my dad is a public person, and I have to not have to act a certain way, but I have to be ready to field questions, or to answer the question of what's it like to know Mark Grodi or have as your dad. So
when you talk about us praying the rosary, and the juxtaposition of that of you just learning it as a young person, because that's what we did as Catholics, but your mother and I, it wasn't our tradition at all,
right.
And in fact it was admittedly very difficult for us because of our background. But and I want to mention that to the audience because that sometimes is a struggle for converts to the church.
Sure.
Especially when you're parents. I wanted you and your brothers to be authentic Catholics. And I was just learning what that meant myself as a father. And I wasn't the most perfect father in terms of those things, but trying to do that. I think maybe the most important thing that I wanted to convey to you as a young person was a love for Christ. And if you look back to those days, do you think you caught the faith during those days? When you look back in your life, Peter, and when did it become more than a cartoon picture on a book, and it became something deep?
Sure. Well, as you know, our relationship with God, relationship with Jesus is this. It's a relationship, same as with anyone. It doesn't start and end, in a moment. It's something that happens in stages, and there are significant moments and there are down moments and everything. But I remember a very distinct moment in my earlier childhood that I at least identify as the moment when I really met God in a real way as a child. I don't even know if I've told you this, actually. I told Mom this the other day.
Oh, why didn't get you on the program? So
I know, right? You can. Well, we'll have to drive home together. I'll fill you in the rest of the way. But we have I have a little brother, Richard, which you've probably encountered him on the show every once in a while. But it wasn't the easiest. I didn't have the easiest childhood with him. Now, mind you, there's a lot of, internal drama with that. Any big brother has trouble with his little brothers. And of course, that's just how life is. And it seems like the biggest thing in the world when you're 7 years old and you don't get along well with your little brother. And so I remember this one day, and I don't remember at what happened at all, but I remember I was very frustrated about something. And I was very frustrated in particular because I had a great relationship with John Mark, with my older brother. And I'd always look forward to having that same relationship with my little brother, and it wasn't panning out the way I thought it was going to. And so I remember I was laying on my bed, and I was crying. And in that moment, somehow, instinctually, or the Holy Spirit caused me to go to God in that moment. And I asked God, I was like, why did you do this to me? A question that probably everybody has asked at some point in their life, and this is the most overly dramatic, thing for a kid to ask. But why did you do this to me? Why couldn't he just be normal? Why couldn't my relationship with him just be normal? And, I didn't have an answer. And God didn't come down and explain it to me. But I knew he was there in that moment. And I knew there was an answer. And it's funny because then Mom walked in pretty soon after that. And she kind of noticed, and I think I sort of asked the same thing of hers, like, why all this? And she said something, and I'm sure at the time she didn't know what really she was saying exactly, but she said, he's going to get you to heaven. It's in some sense, it's kind of it can be seen as maybe a cliche phrase or whatever, but it opened up to me an aspect of the reality of who God is that I just wouldn't have come to otherwise. That there's meaning in suffering, that God is with us in a special way in suffering, and that suffering is the way that we grow to become the men and women that God wants us to be, Mm-hmm. And so that spark there was really huge, actually, for me. So that was a childhood moment, I guess.
I had never heard that moment. And for those of you listening on radio, my guest is my son, Peter Grodi. But what's amazing is that was a seed that sunk into your character, though. Mm-hmm. Because I see that in so many ways when I see you working with people, helping your younger brother in very generous ways when Richard has his unique challenges, and we all know that. But I see that as a seed that has led to where you're going to go in a month when the bishop lays his hands on you. That was a seed. That led to all that.
Absolutely.
As you, again, developing as a young man, let's talk about that. Moving on from there, I'm traveling around a lot, so I didn't get to really know you for about 15 years.
Sure.
Because I'm always at EWTM, I'm joking like that. Good times on the farm.
Yeah, I enjoyed the farm a lot.
Remember that when we had that calf? Do you remember that one? I remember that when
I had to get to a baseball game, and that's why I was really frustrated because the calf was not coming quickly, and I was going to miss the baseball game. Yeah, and then it ended up coming quicker than we ever thought it would come, right onto your lap, basically, as far as I can recall. But
we had great times on the farm.
Yeah.
When you look back now, you're getting ready to become a priest. Would you say that life on the farm had any particular impact on your character, on your understanding of faith, just the experience of?
Sure. I mean, in one sense, how could it not? You know, I mean, how could growing up in the midst of the vestiges of God's creation, you know, I mean, the vestige of God's person and personality present around, you know, throughout this whole quarantine thing, I've been home with my dad and my mom, and we've been bird watching, avidly bird watching. But it is amazing because you wake up in the morning and you go out on the porch and there's a cacophony, you know, a cacophony of sounds, of voices, of creation singing out in glory to God. And so just to be around that so much as a child, to go out and have the experience of getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning when it's 15 degrees out and it's dark and you got to go out and you got to milk a cow, and it's just awful. But it was radically formative. You know, I remember I would sit there and in silence. And I think I probably came into a relationship with silence, with God in silence throughout a lot of things that we did at the farm. And, you know, for having a relationship with Jesus Christ in prayer, that's an important thing to have. And it's not something that's automatic these days by any means, as we all know. And so that was huge. But, you know, with most kids going through high school, you know, it takes a back seat to other concerns you have in your life that don't necessarily need to be mentioned explicitly, because we all know what they are. You know, they just those are things that come to the center of your mind. So even though I'd been thinking about like priesthood before that, then I started thinking that, oh, maybe I need to be a doctor because I need to take care of a wife and kids and things. And so I started thinking about all that stuff, and all the usual dramas happened, everything. But at the end of high school, Mom kind of forced me a little bit, not exactly forced me, but pressured me to go on a pilgrimage to Lourdes in France. We went there with a group from our parish, and my best friend was with us, and that was a really great time. But I remember at the end of that trip, we were at Mass and we were receiving the Eucharist, and then came one of the few times in my life where I really felt that I almost heard the audible voice of God. You know, you don't have many of those in your life, but every once in a while you have some time where you're like, whoa, what was that, you know? And it was simply God wanting me to think about being a priest. And it scared me enough at the time, you know? And I mention that not necessarily because I'm trying to tell my vocation story, but because what ended up happening throughout, I would say, the next 10 years of my life is that my growing relationship with Christ, of learning to trust in Christ, learning to trust in His plan above all the fears and things that get in the way, above all the other stuff of the world that kind of claws for your attentions, you know, and my growing relationship with Christ and all that, it really coincided with His call for me, with my call to the priesthood, because as he called me more and more and showed me that this is something I needed to discern, then my spiritual life, you know, my life with Christ and my life in the church, it ceased to, it couldn't just maintain a sort of a sidecar status with the rest of the things that I wanted to do. You know, whether it was medical school or you know, getting married, all those other things, if I was being honest with myself, they always had to take a side seat to asking what God wanted me to do. And because of that, it couldn't, you know, all that stuff, all the religion, everything couldn't just remain a sidecar. It had to take first priority. And that was the development throughout the next 4 years of college, really, was how does this all take a priority in my life? So,
you know, there's something else that you did and your brothers did, or what we were as a family were involved in, community theater.
Yeah.
And the reason I wanted to bring that up is, when you look back on that, I don't look on that as just one of those many things we did. I saw that as an important part of your character too. Mm-hmm. When you look back on those years in community theater, did that have its own impact on where God has taken you at this time?
Yeah, I think so. I think about it every once in a while. I'm like, I don't think I'll ever know fully the extent that all that kind of had a formative effect on me. But I think I know for one thing that, you know, when I got into classes at Seminary about homiletics, and I stood up there to speak, And a lot of guys would talk about being nervous and in front of, speaking to people or speaking to big groups. And I'm nervous about plenty of things, and I get anxious about things like everybody. But that's not one of them. not anymore. Not after having to, play Prince Charming in enough play. Oh my gosh, you can't get any more embarrassing than that. So that was a thing that I was already used to. I knew that I could be a public speaker if that's where God called me to be, and I knew that I could give messages with energy. I knew that I could be passionate. I could allow my internal passion to flow out. So in a sense, it helped me not to be a fake person like you are in theater, but in a sense, performing something. It's not necessarily about performing. It's not about putting on something fake, but it's more about giving the performance, giving the thing you're doing, giving the message that you're doing with the energy and with the quality that it deserves. Yeah. It's not about putting on something fake, but it's about doing it the way it deserves to be done. Yeah. So that's why I think it helped me.
I think the reason that your mother and I wanted that for you guys is because people always talk about homeschooling. Mm-hmm. They say you're missing the social. Well, we wanted to make sure you had that, and you guys just shined in that. But it also connected with, because this is why I asked that question. I know for me as a speaker, when I was a preacher, it's one thing to write your homily, mm-hmm. but half of it comes when you're communicating with the people in the congregation.
Sure, absolutely.
You know what I mean? I mean, it's when you're on stage, you might know those lines completely, but as a part of it, that's completely new when you're in front of those people.
Yeah.
And you know what I'm talking about. You're communicating to them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a thing that, as I've heard you in your first homilies, as you're starting to get used to giving them.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, another thing that I know led to this, I think it was you were all set to go to Bowling Green State University. You're all set to go.
Yeah, that was a weird time.
And then your mother and I felt that God was calling to make a decision here. Yeah. And I think that had a big impact on you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really don't even know how to start with that, because there were so many aspects of going to Franciscan that were incredibly formative. And I was just telling someone the other day that at Franciscan they have these to call them like spiritual like fraternities at a college would be it's a little crude to call them that, but they're sort of like spiritual or religious fraternities. They're called households at Franciscan. And they're a group of men, and they bond around, each household bonds around a specific set of virtues or ideals that they really strive to live out. Kind of like Franciscans, they really strive to live out a certain way of life. Or versus Dominicans and etc. And so when I was at Franciscan, I studied abroad in Austria as part of their program, and during one of those trips, during one of the trips during that semester, we went to Assisi in Italy, the place of St. Francis. Obviously, a very special place for anyone who has a relationship with a Franciscan institution. And while I was there, for anyone who's been there, they can really, I believe that you can really identify with me on this, that there is a presence there of holiness, of significance, that it's palpable. You can feel it in the air. I've never externally felt the presence of God just literally embedded in a place more than that. And so as I was walking around there, I started to feel that voice again, that little voice pricking at my conscience. Like, there's more. You want to do something more with your life. You want to give your life to God in a way that is reflected in the lives that made this place so significant. And so I started thinking about religious life and priesthood and everything, and it started to, as soon as I realized that I was thinking about it, like when all of a sudden you catch yourself and you're like, what is going on? I got very scared. I mean, at the time I was quite taken with a girl who was on the trip with me, and so it was one of those times where that sidecar was starting to get in the way of all these other plans that I had, and that brought a lot of fear, and it was like a clenched fist, in my mind. Like, I wanted to maintain control over my life, and I was afraid that God was trying to take that away from me. And I wrestled with it, for 3 hours. I wrestled with God, like Jacob, just back and forth, just walking the streets of Assisi. And I remember the feeling and the moment when, like, that clenched fist of tension, I just let that go. And I said, God, I don't know what it is you want me to do. I don't know, maybe it'll be the priesthood, maybe it'll be something else, but I'm ready to say yes to whatever it is. And that was huge. Like for me, that's what conversion throughout life represents, is a series of these fists of tension and control, where you're just trying to maintain some sort of feeling of autonomy from God, and then letting it go, over and over again with all these different things in our life. I want to hold on to that. I want to hold on to this. I want to hold on to this feeling of control. I want to hold on to this, vice that I have, and of just letting that go in Christ and saying, I'll do whatever you want me to do. So that was another big thing. Anyway, to bring back around, that experience was what made me realize that it could no longer be a sidecar in my life. It's not that it wasn't important to me, but it could no longer just be something. If I was going to try to discern what God wanted me to do, I needed to make it first and foremost, and I needed people to help me do that. I couldn't just do it alone. And it was through that experience that I then decided to join a household at Franciscan. I joined a household called Disciples of the Word, which they're all about Scripture, which was perfect. And they were incredibly helpful, incredibly formative for me. I still tell people that my time in that household was probably the most accelerated period of spiritual growth for me that I've had. Seminary has been really great and everything, but in terms of the acceleration that I experienced, in terms of where my relationship with God was beforehand, and then where it was a year and a half later, was the most significant I've experienced.
Well, when your mother and I think about you becoming a priest, it certainly was something we always thought about for you, but we wanted to figure out what's the right balance. How do we push? How do we hold back? And we're not lifelong Catholics, so it's even a little bit different about when you want your son to be a minister, as a Protestant. So we didn't know this was happening to you. You didn't tell us these things. Maybe you told your mother, you didn't tell me, but didn't know that, which I look back and that's the way the Lord wanted it for you. This had to be you, not because it was what I wanted. It had to be for you, and we're just excited about seeing that happen. We're going to pause now. We'll come back in a minute. I want to talk about Peter's music. That was a big part of his journey, because he went to Bowling Green, got involved with music, and then his call there, St. Meinrad, and I want to find out what is the verses that really have inspired you, who's your patron saint, all those neat things, and a couple other things we'll come back to in just a moment. So we'll see you in a bit. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and my guest for this evening is my middle son, Peter. And it's a great pleasure to have him on the program. Before I get back to the story, I just want to remind all of you to, if you can, go to chnetwork.org. That's the website of the Coming Home Network International, where you can hear all kinds of great conversion stories and read conversion stories. And also, if you're on the journey, or if you're thinking of leaving the church, give us a call. We'd love to talk to you, to help you in your journey. So, well, Peter, I'm hearing parts of your story that I didn't know exactly, which is good. I mean, good in the sense that it's good for me to know, how the Lord touched you. Because as a father, as a mother, we don't know how much to push our kids. We want to be good models, but we're flawed. We all are flawed. And but your wonderful experience at Franciscan, which we are so glad that we had that opportunity. I'd thought about other Catholic schools, but that was the closest one, and we're glad that you went.
We considered Christendom and Wyoming Catholic. We took a look at those too, and
Yeah, Ave Maria, down.
Oh yeah, well, I didn't think about that one.
We thought about that.
Yeah.
I follow the compass rule. I take a map of the United
Right.
States and I take an old compass and I put the.
I remember you doing that.
Yeah.
That was the reason. That was what convinced me not to go to Christendom. Actually, was because you did that, and I was like, "You're right." Yeah, it's like there's plenty of other colleges within this radius that are just as good, that I wouldn't have to be so far from home.
It was a negative of the other schools, but if you'd gone to one of those schools, we might not have seen you as much. And
Yeah.
so that was the beauty of being able to see each one a lot.
Yeah.
But you went from Franciscan.
Sure.
And talk about what happened next, because you didn't just go straight to seminary. You had had a time.
Yeah, God's way of like directing you along the way of life. It's so funny. It only happened. You can only see it in retrospect so much of the time, that he's really the one behind it, And that was certainly that move from college to the next part of my life was one of those really, really strong moments that I only saw the full presence of God in later on. And it was, so I was finishing up college, and I was a philosophy degree, which meant that wasn't a whole lot on the horizon in terms of what I could do right outside of college. But I was thinking about medical school, and I was thinking about, a few different other options. I was a chemistry minor as well. But I was also very much thinking about priesthood. And I think at the time I was actually leaning a bit more towards Franciscan religious life rather than diocesan priesthood. But I just knew through my discernments and working through it and everything, and I knew that it wasn't fear holding me back or anything, but something told me it wasn't the right time yet. That I hadn't gotten from God what I believed needed to be gotten, if that made any sense. Like, this is the time when he should give me when if he wants me to jump right into seminary right now, he should give me the nudge, And I just wasn't there. And so I didn't know what I was going to do right after college. And I remember it was in the space of like a month, all this stuff started happening. So first of all, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I think I mentioned that to you because then you suggested maybe I could move up with your mom, with my grandmother, up in Perrysburg, or move around there somewhere. Just to keep an eye out while I'm trying to figure all this out. And I was like, oh yeah, I don't see any issue with that. There's doesn't seem to be, I don't know where else I would go, so why not? Well, like literally within a couple days, my best friend from childhood, who was going to Bowling Green State University, who had gone through a few dark years in his life, called me up out of nowhere, and we started talking, and it turns out he had this conversion back to the church, and he was going to start working at the church there that is a university ministry parish, that he was, we're living at the Newman Center there and everything. He'd been living there during his time at college, and now he was going to start working part-time as he finished his degree. Well, we just started to get to and I'm like, oh, guess what? I'm probably gonna move up there because, near Bowling Green, Perrysburg, because I'm gonna start helping take care of my grandma. And he's like, no kidding, there's actually some jobs open at the church. I'm like, oh, wow. So I decided to apply for a couple of those jobs. I applied to be something rather more innocuous, more just, I think it was like a communications person or something like that. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I figured, hey, I get the best shot at that. What they also needed was their musician, a director of worship. And I told my friend that I'm interested in that, but I know there's no way that I'm qualified to get that job. I'm not a professional musician. I've only taken really a handful of piano classes. I've just basically played piano and guitar as kind of a side hobby. But, he mentioned it to the priest there, who it ended up halfway through the summer, they ended up kind of being stuck in a bad position, and they needed somebody quick. And so they brought me up for an interview, and I tried out, and they decided that I was good enough. Somehow, by the grace of God, it really all just fell together perfectly. It was like you dumped a jigsaw puzzle out of the box, and they all landed in the exact spot as a ready-made puzzle to get me up there. Now, jump forward a year. A lot of discernment happened in that year. I dated a girl for a while, and eventually what I realized in dating her, and she ended up agreeing with me, which is kind of funny. But I realized that my discernment had gotten to the point where I realized I could not move forward in good conscience or with any sort of peace in my heart any other direction in my life until I went and further explored that call. And I knew that the only next step that was left for me was seminary. And so I remember I was sitting in the chapel and I realized that I can't move forward in my relationship with her, and I can't move forward in my career. I can't move forward in any of these things in my life, really, until I've gone the next step there and seen it. And I remember telling her, and she was like, "Yep." So I was like, "Okay, well, yeah." And I remember I sent in the application there. But what was important about all that is that movement up there, both was really important for me in terms of discernment, and that happened that year, and formation that happened through, living at the Newman Center and doing campus ministry and learning to play music better, all this stuff, but also of becoming a part of the Toledo Diocese up in Ohio, which is not our home diocese, but is where you came from, in Perrysburg, and it's where I'm studying for now as well. I'm incarnated in the Diocese of Toledo in America, as it's called, in America. So,
yeah, I don't know if I've ever said this on the program, but I was born in Toledo, and my parents, the year before I was born, were living in an apartment that has been torn down, and this place where that apartment was, it's a parking lot at Cathedral, of the Toledo Cathedral.
I forgot, you did tell me that.
So in other words, I was conceived on the parking lot at Cathedral where my parents lived.
Oh, man.
But it's funny, full circle, now you're becoming a priest and will be ordained in that cathedral.
Yeah, wow.
And again, it was because of that discernment year to go to Bowling Green, to do that. How did you end up, of all seminaries, St. Meinrad? Tell them about your experience at St. Meinrad.
Sure, yeah. Well, St. Meinrad first of all, St. Meinrad is a saint. It's not just a made-up name. I had no idea who that was before I went to seminary there, but it's called St. Meinrad Seminary and School of Theology. But what it also is a Benedictine monastic community. So it's a seminary that's run by a Benedictine monastic community that lives next door. And so the Diocese of Toledo for a long time has had a relationship with that seminary. And if you don't know how it works, a diocese develops a relationship with one or more seminaries, and those are the places that they send their seminarians to. And so it's not like you just go like, well, I'm going to seminary now, I guess I'll just apply to one of any, 20 places or however there many are or in the area. They had 3 different places. And so I went on a trip with the vocation director. We traveled down to the Josephinum, to Mount St. Mary's in the west at Cincinnati, and then to St. Meinrad, which is way down south in Indiana, basically out in the middle of nowhere, west an hour from Louisville. It's amazing. Like you're driving through these woodlands and you can't see anything, and then all of a sudden you pull around the corner and it's like Hogwarts is up on the hill over there. It's incredible. It's incredible, beautiful arch abbey. And we went there and we visited, and one of the things I was struck by most, and this ended up becoming a really big, important part of my life, obviously it's culminated in a particular project that I just finished, is the monastic chanting of Gregorian chant and of modern notation chant and English chant is beautiful. And it all kind of comes back full circle, because I think that the biggest appreciation that I have for Gregorian chant is that it is in constant relationship with silence. And so going back to my childhood, when I learned to appreciate silence through, milking cows, or simply, I remember sometimes in the deep of winter, a foot of snow, I'd go out in my, full snow uniform because I was bored and didn't have anything else to do. And I would lay down and I would stare at the sky for an hour in silence. There, that appreciation of silence. And I showed up there at St. Meinrad, and I was listening to these monks chant their divine office 5, 6, 7 times a day. And on my way home with the vocation director, he said, "How did you like it? How do you like it there? What do you think?" And I didn't really know what else to say. I really liked it, and I just said, I was thinking of it's out in the middle of the woods and everything, and I said, it felt like going home. And I really didn't say anything else about it. And I didn't know if he was going to send me there or some other place. And I was, I at that time, I was fully open to whatever the diocese wanted me to do. And they ended up sending me there, for which I am eternally grateful. Eternally grateful.
Was it, I remember you talking about, it remained a struggle for a while whether you would go to be a diocesan priest or a monastic priest.
Yeah, so my focus kind of changed from Franciscan religious life in terms of what was the alternative to diocesan life for me. So it kind of switched from Franciscan to Benedictine pretty soon. And a lot of seminarians talk about this. I caught the monk bug. They talk about. I caught the monk bug, and that, it still pulls on me. It still pulls on my heart sometimes because the monastic life is so beautiful, and I think of it. The beauty of the monastic life for me is that it's like the disciples when they visited the mountaintop with Jesus and they saw him transfigured. In the monastic life, these men, they spend all their time, so much of their time praying and working and trying to do the liturgy beautifully, trying to give glory to God by doing the liturgy in the way that it should be done, and trying to give the liturgy as much beauty as it can. And they become really good at it. And so a lot of people would visit the monastery, especially for like Holy Week, and they see these incredible liturgies, incredible. And hopefully, what I realized when I was there for a Palm Sunday, what it made me think of is that this incredible, beautiful liturgy they're doing with 4-part chanted, gospel passages of the entire thing, is that the liturgy that is happening there, the sacrifice of the Mass that is happening in that moment, is the same one that's happening in the middle of a broken down church with 30 people, with no music, and a priest who can't sing. It's the same liturgy that's happening. But just as Jesus, who in his plain human body went up on this mountaintop and was transformed before the eyes of his disciples and gave them this glimpse into his glory that they were able to take with them in their hearts and give them a real sense for who Jesus was. People can visit a monastery and they can see the liturgy in as much glory as we can give it here on earth. And what they're seeing is not just, is not something different really than what's happening in their own little town. Right. And they can take that back with them and hopefully appreciate the Mass wherever they go a little bit more.
I remember the times when you were struggling with diocesan priesthood or monastic life and that. And it seemed to me that the places where the needle turned to diocesan commitment was the experiences you had at Paulding, Ohio, at Norwalk, Ohio. Talk a bit about, if you would, the coming alive of that priestly call as you served. You had to leave the monastery for a while for your pastoral year at Norwalk and those other churches.
It's something that I find very difficult to put my finger on, I'm going to be honest, in terms of how it all happened. How I discerned to become a diocesan priest. And I think part of it is that, when you're discerning, it's very difficult because you're discerning between two different goods. When you're trying to decide between to do something right and do something wrong, discernment's pretty easy. It's like, okay, one's right and the other's wrong. Discernment of vocation is tough because you're trying to choose between two different very good things, or many different very good things. And when you begin, it's more about marriage and priesthood. And obviously, you can't join priesthood or become a celibate person simply because you don't desire marriage. That's not how it works. No. If you don't think you can be a good husband and a good father, well then, by gosh, you're not going to be a good priest. So it's just how it's going to happen. But in this, I was trying to discern between diocesan priesthood and monastic life, two very good things, and two real desires that I had in my heart. And I saw aspects of them both that really drew to me, that really called to me. But it really, if I'm going to put a finger on the thing that tipped the needle, it was simply that God kept me where I was, if that makes any sense. You know, I was ready for God to make a change if that's what he wanted me to do. But God didn't change the course. You know, when God puts you on a path, you don't just think of all the other paths that you could be on in life and just try to, you know, jump off whenever you can or get ready to jump off whenever you can. You simply put your trust in God and you stay on the path that you're on until he tells you to go, you know? And I got to a point where I realized this is the path that God's had me on. And as far as I can tell, in all honesty, in my relationship with God, that's where he kept me. So I said, all right, let's go. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to move on, you know? And a lot of confirming things have happened, I would say, in this last year and a half. Becoming, you know, ordained a deacon is a huge thing. But more than anything, I'm just excited to be ordained a priest and to start serving people. You know, and a big part of me when this whole quarantine thing started was really chomping at the bit, you know, because I just wanted to be celebrating the Mass for people. And wanted to be offering up Christ, you know, in the Mass as a prayer for all the people that are suffering right now. And I wanted to be doing that already, you know, but you know, I still have another month. So
Part of the patience.
yeah.
We've got about 9 minutes just to let you know much, because I had a lot of things I'd like to ask you, but I had a couple things I wanted to ask you. I did want to ask you that you studied, you discerned priesthood and went to seminary during a time when the church has gone through great scandal, great struggle that has affected a lot of young men your age to make them pause a bit about the priesthood. Did you and your classmates struggle with that? How did you guys help yourselves deal with this difficult time in the church?
Well, one thing in particular that seminaries these days are much better at doing, and in a great way in response to the recent crises that have happened, is they're very good at something. They're much more focused on doing something called human formation, which, you know, when people ask me what do I do in seminary or what do I study, most of the time I get, and you know, they guess something along the lines of, well, you're basically just standing around practicing Mass all day, you know, and then maybe golfing on the weekends, right? Is that how it works? You know, there's so much that goes on, and one of the biggest aspects is human formation, which is basically just helping you to become a healthy human being. You know, helping you to work through psychologically and in counseling your different junk that you got in your life in your past that's affecting you now, you know, and learning to come to terms with that. And having those resources of a counselor and really the personal resources of have worked through that stuff, it really helps when you encounter something as difficult and as challenging as recognizing that there have been a lot of fellow priests in the church and even in bishops who have not followed the way, you know. And there's really two responses that you can have. One is of difficulty, you know, of maybe losing a little bit of hope. But the other one is in recognizing this situation. It's really just another call that we need men out there who are willing to be good priests. You know, it's not as saying, well, the priesthood is wrong or the priesthood is bad. It's really just saying we need men to help represent the priesthood well, you know, represent Christ well.
A scripture came to mind as I think about you and what you're going through, and it's actually a part of the passage that you just preached on last week, the vine and the branches passage.
Sure.
For John, you have to be.
Yeah.
But there's a verse 2 is interesting. It says, "Every branch of mine that bears no fruit, he takes away. And every branch of mine that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear fruit." You mentioned earlier suffering. And there's that challenge. You know, if we're not producing fruit, the church has an avenue for us, and that's called confession, so that we're not just gone. But if we are producing fruit, he still prunes us. He keeps chipping away at us.
Yeah.
A little bit of that was seminary.
Yeah, well, and the other part of that passage is the significance of Christ talking about what it means to remain in him. stay in me, remain attached to the vine that is my life, that is my, the constant sustenance. And I think that's probably the biggest reaction I saw all throughout seminary when we encountered these, the crises in the church and the abuses and everything, is we just realized if we don't want to become like that, what we have to do is make sure that we at all times are receiving our life blood of our spiritual human lives from the veins of Christ, from the vine of Christ. And so for many of us, it was simply just a call to go deeper. I mean, if Christ is with us, who can be against? He will, if we are truly, receiving the life of the lifeblood of Christ in the Mass and in prayer, in our relationship with Christ, then he won't let us go astray, even if suffering comes along the way, so.
I hadn't thought about asking this, but chant doesn't stay at the seminary.
It shouldn't.
Does chant help you abide?
Chant helps me abide in so many ways. Because there's a stillness and a beauty about chant that simply helps you, instead of kind of taking you out and instead of taking you to sort of like this external, exuberance, which it can be obviously is a good thing, exuberance and glory of God. It helps you to sit where you are and to experience the life of Christ that is in you, to recognize that Christ is already there, and he's a mystery and a beautiful, deep, incredible mystery, as deeper than any human other person, who's already like an incredible mystery greater than the universe itself. It helps you recognize the depth of Christ, especially in the liturgy, and recognizing helping you to recognize that and get in touch with that, and to simply abide in that moment, to simply remain in that moment in silence. So,
well, two things I want to talk to you.
Sure.
Ask you. And one of the reasons I ask is because there are two things. There's so many things that you and I share, of course, father and son, and
bird
our
watching.
family, and bird watching, and the farm, and your mother, and the whole family, and all the blessings that we have through that.
Mm-hmm.
Two things that you and I share, and I want you to get your perspective on them. Number one, we share a favorite verse.
We do.
Tell them that verse and why that's important to you.
Mm-hmm.
Proverbs 3, 5, and 6.
Yeah. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your path.
Talk about why has that verse been important to you in your calling?
Yeah. A lot of the things I talked about so far, I mean, when I give my when I give my vocation story, my discernment story, I talk about it in terms of significant moments along the way, because ultimately it's like, conversion story or vocation story is kind of like the sea, it's like sort of just kind of continuing on your journey, and then all of a sudden there's like this really significant moment that's the top of a wave, and then you kind of continue on your journey. All of it's part of the journey. It's still moving forward, but there's some significant moments that are those crests. And for me, a lot of those moments that I've mentioned are times when it wasn't so much me understanding where God was taking me all of a sudden, or saying like, oh, I know where I need to go now. It was more of a letting go of my need to know, of my need to control where I went. And so ultimately, that verse, I came to realize the significance of that verse in my life after all this happened in retrospect. But if trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding of where you need to go in life, in all your ways acknowledge him. If you put him first, then he will direct your path. You won't necessarily know where the path is going. You won't know the steps you need to take to get there necessarily. But if you do those things, it's simple. It takes away all those fears of the possibilities, all that stuff, and it simply says, acknowledge God, love him, follow him, and you won't go wrong.
1 minute.
Yeah.
Your favorite saint?
Well,
Isaac Jogues.
He's my confirmation saint. It's kind of a close tie these days with John Cardinal Henry Newman, but
yeah, of course.
But Isaac Jogues, and the reason I chose him as my vocation saint is because if there's one thing you know about Saint Isaac Jogues when you read his story, it's his incredible courage. And I never thought of myself as the most courageous guy. It's been a struggle all my life to kind of deal with fear and anxiety, but and the fact that he was tortured and then had the opportunity to escape from the people who tortured him, and then voluntarily returned to minister to them. once again, I pray to him simply to say, give me the courage that you had to bring the gospel, even when things are scary and crazy like that. So,
Peter, thank you for joining me on the journey
absolutely.
home.
Yeah.
This is great. It's been a long time coming.
Good to be here.
And I talked so much about it in the program. It's just so good for the audience to get a chance to see you. And I'm going to ask them to also pray for you because
Thank
you've
you.
got about a month to go.
Approaching a month. Yeah.
That's right. And then that new stage in your life. So thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
And thank you for your message. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I do pray that my son's journey and his calling and his discernment to follow Christ and the witness of grace in his life is an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next time.